thing, though she's from Atlanta. So this is a great celebration of the Classical Summer School's Centennial. And I want to begin with a few acknowledgments. Brian Rose, who you all know, who was on our board for 17 years and was a fantastic interlocutor between the Academy with a large A. And
recording in progress.
Thank you. With a small a. As well as Michael Putnam, our life trustee. Both Brian and Michael were behind a campaign some years ago to endow the Classical Summer School, which was a great project. And we have to thank Roberto Mignoni for his wonderful gift that really anchored this program and preserved our ability to provide the training that the Classical Summer School provides. Other critical Classical Summer School supporters include Carol Ann Collier and Menzie, Kathy Gefkin, and Ili Naj. And it's good to be surrounded by so many old friends. Lisa Mignoni, who I think was at my first meeting of the classicists in New Orleans. Wonderful. I remember you had a tiara at one point. Oh, did I? Sorry. Well, where it belonged. Clearly, Ingrid Rowland and Liz Bartman. It's great to see you. And Miles McDonald and Sanjaya, thank you for all of your work. Over its 100-year history, the CSS has given American high school Latin teachers and graduate students in classics the opportunity to study the material culture of Roman antiquity. The insights that participants gain are only possible through direct experience. I think we're all living proof of that. By seeing the sites, the topography, and the objects in front of us, we understand more about our place in history and also the constituent elements of that history. Over 2,000 people have attended the CSS since its founding, helping to shape the field of classics. It is a critical program within the AAR's broader mission of supporting in-depth scholarship in the humanities, including ancient studies. At a time when the classics and the humanities at large seem to be at risk on many fronts, programs like CSS, and the Academy are more valuable than ever. We thank all of you for your support, your participation, and your commitment and being part of this project. Thank you all so much. And now I'd like to welcome our Andrew Mellon Professor Marla Stone, who will take care of the proceedings.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Mark. So I just want to welcome everyone to our celebration of 100 years of the Classical Summer School. We have a wonderful mix in the audience of summer school directors, past and present, assistant directors, past and present, alumni and current students, and then members of our current American Academy community. And our program that's going to follow is going to be one of learning and also of sharing memories and experiences. And I imagine we'll have a few inside jokes as well. 100 years is a lot, right? In a world of constant change, a program of this continuity and stability is frankly remarkable. And as Mark Robbins said, truly remarkable that thousands of students have come to Rome and have shared an on-site, deeply embedded experience in the city, an experience of learning Roman art, history, and archaeology. A common body of knowledge has passed from one generation of scholars to the next over the course of the last 100 years, and today we have the embodiment of that transfer of knowledge. We have Kathy Gefkin, who taught Miles McDonald, who then taught Lisa Mignone and Sanjaya Thakur, and then we have Aaron Lamb, who was taught by Suzanne Luznia, and probably other connections that I haven't mentioned. And in the process, each generation has shaped the knowledge, bringing to bear new perspectives and interpretations, making the classics and the study of Rome a living thing. So with the continuity, we also have to acknowledge and celebrate change. For many, many decades, the students of the Classical Summer School came from the same limited East Coast universities and colleges, private universities and colleges, but now we draw our students from across the country and from public as well as private universities and high schools. For many decades, the student body looked the same and came from similar socioeconomic, ethnic, and racial backgrounds. Now the Classical Summer School looks more like America, and students come from a diversity of racial, ethnic, educational, and economic backgrounds. The curriculum, while still steeped in the belief that an in-depth, firsthand knowledge of the growth and development of the Roman Republic and Empire has to be the basis and starting point of studying ancient Rome, the curriculum has expanded. Emperors, political history, art and architectural history, and archaeology certainly remain, but many of the questions are now taken from other disciplines and have reshaped the study of ancient Rome. So Roman history now asks questions about social history, gender history, history of sexuality, as well as questions borrowed from literary studies, subaltern studies, and even post-colonial studies. Now the lived experience of the enslaved, of women, of children, make a core part of the curriculum. New approaches look at the impact and reception of Rome globally and over time. Now, along with this awareness of the importance of all this innovation in the summer school, I want to also acknowledge the legacy of the Academy's own contribution to the field of classics in the United States, and the fact that the American Academy's commitment to the classics and to Roman history, art, and archaeology remains strong and remains central to our mission as an institution. Now, thinking about change and continuity, I'd like to conclude with just a couple of sentences from the 1923 annual report of the American Academy in Rome, which discussed the first session of the Classical Summer School. So, quote, "Due to the energy and perseverance of the Committee on the School of Classical Studies, the first session of the summer school was held from July 9th to August 18th. The object of the summer school is to meet the needs of college students who, either on account of their professional work or limited funds, have a short time to devote to studies in Rome. We have 5 students registered. 6 weeks may seem, at first glance, too short a time to obtain results, but it should be remembered that students are college graduates and thus prepared for intensive work. Every one of these students returns to America prepared to resume the teaching of classics with increased enthusiasm and a clearer understanding of Roman life." We have a wonderful program ahead. We're going to start with 5 short papers and then a conversation between Sebastian Hurl, our Drew Heights librarian, and Kathy Geffican, former director and emeritus professor of classics at Wellesley College. So our first speaker is going to be Erin Lamb, who was a Classical Summer School participant in 2012, just finished a term as the Consortium for Faculty Diversity postdoctoral scholar at Bryn Mawr College, and will very soon be starting in Paradise as the UC Presidential Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Santa Barbara. Thank you, Erin.
So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Marla, and for all the organizing that you've been doing. And thank you to Suzanne for inviting me in the first place. I'm very excited to return here after nearly, actually more than a decade away since my summer school term. And today I'm going to talk to you about my work as a queer and feminist scholar working with the classical tradition. And the title of my talk is a little bit of a misleading title here. Cruising Rome, Queer Orientations in Ovid's Ars Amatoria. Unfortunately, because of time, we won't quite get to the cruising part. But hopefully I will titillate you enough that you'll want to read the full article version when that's published. So Ovid's Ars Amatoria is a work of Latin love elegy published between 2 BCE and 2 CE, possibly contributing to Ovid's exile. And I describe it as a politically incorrect pickup manual. It's composed of 3 books. The first 2 books are addressed to young men, and the last book to young women, with instructions on how to find each other, for lack of a better term. And today, my talk is concerned with the walking itineraries, which are these short passages describing where to find young people in Rome for sexual dalliances, and they occur in the first and third books. These walking itineraries take meandering paths through Rome, unlike, for example, Tristia 3:1 or Horace Satires 1:9, which take much more direct routes through Rome. And my interpretation of this roundabout movement is that there's an increased chance of erotic encounter that is analogous to the practices of queer urban cruising. And so my talk today is greatly influenced by my own memories of walking the city during 2012, the classical summer school directed by Suzanne Luznia. And the millennia of rebuilding and reuse in the city of Rome has created this incredible palimpsest of various historical moments condensed into every inch of the city, as well as an almost stubborn defiance of rectilinearity. So anyone who has attempted to take a straightforward route here, and I count probably everybody in this room, has likely been frustrated by a winding alley that turns around unexpectedly. So the built environment of Rome encourages getting lost, as well as a presentist enjoyment of the sights and people as one meanders through time and space. Okay. So I'll spare you the Latin passage because Erica Zimmerman-Damer has published this very helpful map that catalogs the places that the walking itineraries go through. And so this is the walking itinerary of the first book. And as you can see, I don't know if the arrows are a bit too small, but you kind of do this little loop-de-loop around the Augustan monuments, right? So we're not going from point A to point B, we're kind of traversing the city in this very roundabout way. And similarly, this is the walking itinerary of book 3. Not quite the same path, but there are a couple of places that occur in both passages, which I'll briefly go through. So the first place that occurs in both passages is the Portico of Pompey. And as you can see in the reconstruction here, it's attached to the theater complex, which has cursor, yeah. The theater of Venus Victrix at the back of it. And all of these places that Ovid walks us through in the Ars Amatoria are rendered erotic because they draw crowds of young women. And they draw crowds of young women because of these really beautiful gardens, these water features, these shady porticos where people can just sort of meander and loiter, for lack of a better term. And not only that, a lot of these places are associated with Venus. So again, we have the theater complex with the temple in the back of it. All of these places, or some of these places also have statues of young women, which supposedly draw young women to them. So the next place that occurs in both itineraries is the Portico of Livia, and similarly would have been a nice pleasure garden situation. Here's a Minecraft reconstruction of the garden. This seems to be a strong hobby in Minecraft. If you're ever looking for teaching material, people have reconstructed pretty much all of the Roman Empire in Minecraft. Okay, the next place is the Temple of Palatine Apollo, but Ovid doesn't call it that. Instead, he calls it the Portico of the Danaids. And you can see in this reconstruction these like very small statues right over there. So it's incredibly remarkable that Ovid names this place by these tiny statues instead of saying, like this is a place for Augustus, this is a place of Apollo. Instead, he's characterizing it by these statues of young women. The next place is the Temple of Isis. Again, similarly, young women were supposedly drawn here to pray for marriage. Okay. So that was a really quick run through of the passages. A little bit about my approach. So Turner here is writing about queer cruising, and a queer approach, unlike other approaches to literature and history, the point is to challenge, undermine, refute, and reconfigure the very notion of norms in history. So one might say that my reading of this text is irreverent, right, to compare Ovid to gay cruising, but that's one of the points, and I can talk about this later if folks are interested. And for me, queer works as a verb rather than a noun. It's a performance and a practice rather than a sexual identity. And so again, I'm happy to expand on this, but for me it matters less that Ovid is talking about heterosexual affairs rather than the type of, or how these affairs occur, which is primarily in public space, kind of reclaiming that public space and reorienting it towards eroticism. So how do we understand these walking itineraries? One way is through French philosophy. Desserteaux provides us this structure, this binary of strategies versus tactics. So when we take a look at the map, if you recall the map that Damer provides, that is a strategic point of view of the city. It's a bird's eye view, thinking about proper usage of the city. And one might think about that as the city planner view, and one might align Augustus with that. And we have tactics, on the other hand, which is much more the phenomenological, the experiential, what happens as you experience the city. And it can be very idiosyncratic, like just because a path leads a certain way doesn't mean you have to follow it. And so one of the manifestations of tactics in the built environment is what's called desire lines. And this is a term from architecture. So a desire line is a path that's made in the built environment, and you can see that sort of brownish path on this side. That often is a shortcut or just a way that people want to go that isn't the paved path. And in the city of Rome, we don't tend to have too many of these dirt paths made by feet, but you might think about, for example, the way that stone staircases are grooved, right, rubbed down by many generations of feet, or the way that paths are rubbed smooth because of feet. And desire lines are important because they're a way to speak back to those who built the city, right? They're a way of speaking and surveying, and they're a way of a collapsing time within the built environment, because every footstep you take in a desire line follows generations of footsteps before, right? So we have this collapse of time within a particular usage of space. And so if we think about walking as a type of enunciation, as a type of performance, right, we can think about how one reads the city with your body. So Diane Favreau has written that buildings function like words in a text. And similarly, Desserteaux proposes that footsteps also function like words or like letters, right? So we can think about the way that our bodies move through the city as creating sentences, as creating narratives, as creating stories that can be read in the city. Okay, so how do we think about this and Ovid? So we're gonna have to back up a little bit to some wordplay. Okay, so magic squares. Hopefully you all are familiar with magic squares. On the left, we have the most famous magic square, the Sator square. And magic squares are magic because they can be read in many directions. And the Sator square makes a kind of nonsense sentence, but the Romans were obsessed with this. It shows up everywhere, honestly, across the empire. And on the right, unfortunately, I couldn't get an image, but we have the Roma Amor square, right? So Roma famously backwards is amor, which means love. And so there's all this wordplay about the city of Rome being the city of love. And this association of Roma with amor is also shows up in visual iconography. So we can see here a coin minted by Octavian, and on the head side we see the head of Octavian, and on the tail side we have Venus, right? So associating Octavian with the city of Rome or the Empire of Rome, and Venus there, or Amor. And we have also this coin with Venus on the head side and Octavian victorious on the tail side. So when we look at these two coins together in conversation, they kind of perform this Roma Amor mirroring, right? This palindrome with the visual iconography. So you can see here how the heads and the tails, they mirror each other. Octavian is always looking to the left, Venus always looking to the right. And this visual punning continues on for more than 100 years after Ovid publishes the Ars Amatoria. So we have here the Temple of Venus Felix and Roma Aeterna, designed and completed by the Emperor Hadrian. And this is an incredibly unusual temple in that you can see in the middle there, we have this mirrored statue, this sort of palindrome in the temple structure is incredibly unusual. So we have Roma on one side and Venus, or Amor, as the direct opposite. So within Ovid's text, we see this, this mirroring effect also occurs. This is from Hansi's 2016. And Hansi's has created this great translation where the amor telistic above in the Latin, he's translated to Rome and love, which is very nice there. And one thing to note with the Ovidian telistic is that instead of having Roma and then amor, we have amor and amor. So this has been interpreted as Ovid transfiguring Roma completely into amor. So when we think about this visual wordplay, these magic squares, Rome and Amor together with the walking itineraries, I suggest that we might interpret these walking itineraries as a verbal doubling back, a challenge to linear progressive movement. And I suggest that by walking back and forth or circularly around the city of Rome, you're physically transfiguring Roma into Amor using your body. And desire lines are particularly important, and we might think about Ovid as mapping a desire line through the city, attempting to map it in literary form. And they're important because they bridge the abstract and the material, the textual desire, Ars Amatoria, and the physical city of Rome. And here we have, in a desire line, desire manifest in a public space, and thus a sort of reappropriation or reclaiming of public space. And within queer theory, Berlant and Warner have written about sex in public, and they argue that the policing of sex in public tends to punish minorities, to desexualize space, and to desexualize heteronormative sexual practices. They advocate for a reclaiming of public space through creating queer social worlds and counter-publics, that is, making space for sex and erotics in public, which is what Ovid does. And we have the image on the right. I just draw your attention to the subtitle of Christina Milner's excellent text, Inventing Private Life. So Milner argues that during the time of Augustus, we have this division between public and private that's solidified, right? And the domestic ideal, according to her, emerges as a site for mediating the individual and the state, and especially for enabling the transition of the state's power to onto the individual. And the domestic/private, which is represented by the feminine, especially appeals as a medium because it is supposedly apolitical, universal, and ethical. During the age of Augustus, there's the creation of a new discourse for the proper relation between the individual and the state, private and public, civic and domestic life. And so this action simultaneously intermingles and separates the two spheres. Back to the French philosophy. So we have Lefebvre here, the right of the city, and this text is asking who has the right to the city, right? Who gets the city? And in urging us to imagine a city that belongs to us, its everyday users, the tacticians, right? Lefebvre employs the same vocabulary of the imaginary and the ephemeral that motivates critical fabulation in Black studies as well as queer utopianism. And I argue that Ovid shows us one way to access such an imaginary ephemeral city in constructing his fragmentary and circular view of Rome through these walking itineraries. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Suzanne Luznia, a 1996 fellow, classical summer school participant in 1989, assistant director in 1994, and director 2011 to 2013. And Suzanne is also associate professor of classical studies at Tulane University, and her presentation is entitled "The Classical Summer School and My Path to Severe in Rome." Welcome to the podium, Suzanne.
Yes, so this is more of a reflection, personal reflection than anything else. But I just want to start off by saying I think, as Marla mentioned, I've been very fortunate to have had a very long association with both the American Academy and the Classical Summer School, having, as I said, first being a participant in the program in '89, and David Thompson was the director that year. I was assistente, as it used to be called, to Professor James Anderson, who was the director of the summer school from 1992 to 94, and then my own term as director. And really the academy, getting my introduction to the academy through the summer school, and then longer term relationship with this organization and institution, and the classical summer school itself have been really a major influence on my career path. And so I want to just take you through a few of my experiences with the summer school and share some thoughts on the impact, not only that it had on me, but that it has had on others as well, I think. So first, as a participant in 1989. So some of you will remember what the building looked like back then. Some of you will not. But this is prior to the fantastic renovation that took place in 92, 93. So you can see this is from the roof of the Villa Aurelia. As a participant in the classical summer school that year, that was my first introduction to the American Academy in Rome. I had come to Rome once when I was in high school, but had no idea about any of this. Came here in 1989, met everything about this place and loved it. I met scholars such as Larissa Bonfante, Charles Babcock, Larry Richardson, Darby Scott, Illy Naj, and Kathy Gefkin. People and many, many others, and I'm sure I'm forgetting, who gave us talks and took us around to various sites. Front of the academy before, again, the renovation, before the fountain was put in place. We had a perhaps auspicious start to our summer school in that we had a thunderstorm with hail right after we did our rooftop visit at Villa Aurelia. And I was just so, amazed by that thunderstorm. If you've ever been on the Janiculum during a thunderstorm, you know what I mean. It's just awesome. And I had to take a picture of the hail because nobody would believe me otherwise. We, of course, went to many, many sites. This program in that summer was my first real hands-on experience with learning about the city of Rome, the material culture, the monuments and topography of this city. And we went to the Domus Aurea, which I believe at that time was still not open to the general public then, but of course the Academy got the summer school in. We had to sign away our lives, as I sort of recall, and then we had to put on hard hats to go in. And so inside, and me looking much, much younger. This was also the summer that I was beginning my work, or I was in the midst of work on a master's thesis on Julia Domna. And so this was the summer I got the chance to have the direct introduction to monuments and art having to do with the Severans in Rome. And so that was, of course, a wonderful thing for my career and sort of sent me off in the path that I ended up on, looking at Severan Rome and the monuments. And so naturally, I ended up doing a final project for the summer school that summer on the Severans. We had an option of writing a lesson plan about something, and I decided to do it on Severan art and architecture. And so that was my lesson plan, which, once we go forward to 1994, when I was the assistente, I was able to actually implement that lesson plan as the assistant when we took our group around Rome. I took them on my sort of Severan Rome tour at that point. And I knew after I had participated in that 1989 summer session as a student that I really wanted to come back to the Academy, both as a fellow, and that someday I was hoping I might even get to be the assistente of the summer school. And I have to say, fortunately for me, both of those dreams came true. And it was a real pleasure to be able to be the assistente in the summer of '94, which was one of the hot summers. Not that they aren't all hot, but some are hotter than others. That one was one of the very hot ones. But we got through it all. And as I said, I used my lesson plan to take people around then. We did, as is traditional, the visit to the roof of the Villa Aurelia again, looking out on the city. And that's Jim Anderson there. I got to teach the temple, the round temple at the down by the Forum Boarium area there, which I always have to remind my students is not the Temple to Vesta. But we had a really great group of graduate students and teachers. And it was a time for me to really, hone my skills of teaching on site. I had worked at the Intercollegiate Center in the year prior to that as the graduate assistant, but the summer school was the time when I really got to be, the partner with Jim, teaching all these different sites and kind of really learn how to navigate things like, the heat, the crowds, the traffic, the noise, everything that goes along with teaching on site, but also how to work with the students and make it a good experience for them. And of course, we went around. A picture on the left is the woman who provided the photographs that I have for the 1994 summer school. And that photo is taken, if you don't recognize it, at the top of Trajan's column. So yeah, we got to do that summer. So. All right, so mine is kind of quick here. So as director, which I did from 2011 to 2013, I had a number of very fine assistentes as well. Seth Bernard was my assistant who's seated next to me there in this photo. We had 22 participants composed of graduate students, secondary school teachers, and one undergraduate. That year, and this photo was, you probably recognize, Ostia. We did have the play at Ostia. They had a great time creating various characters, one of whom was Flava Flavian, who wore a sundial with an obelisk clock around his neck, so it was very clever. And one of the joys of teaching the summer school is also introducing students to things around Italy, you know, my favorite things in Rome, but also just more general outside traveling. And so the roadside porchetta stand, you know, that's one of the things that you don't know exists if you've never really been out traveling around in Italy until you do. And my first summer when we did this, as we were coming back from Lucas Ferronii after doing the autoptic exercise, the back of the bus started chanting porchetta, porchetta, porchetta. So I talked to the bus driver. I said, can we stop at the stand? Because it was coming up. And he's like, yes, of course. And so, of course, they got their sandwiches. The bus driver got his porchetta. We were all very, very happy. 2012, I had Meg Andrews as my assistente. And again, just great group. That was the hottest of the 3 summers. It was definitely above 90 and above 100 some days that summer. Sperlonga was lovely because we could cool off there. We had 23 participants that year. Here we are at Largo Argentina in wretched heat. That was the summer that taught me to appreciate the Rome taxi quite a lot for getting back after the end of a half day downtown. In 2013, we did something that hadn't been done because it hadn't been open for tours until fairly soon around then, was that we went to Cinecittà and got the outdoor studio tour, which includes more than just the sets for Rome, but the sets for Rome were the ones that were most interesting. And I think our tour guide who took us through had no idea that she had a bunch of classicists with her, because when we got in and everybody just went, and she tried to give us a little discussion of things, and everybody just burst out and went running around because everybody'd seen Rome, for one thing, on HBO, and everybody was like just fascinated with all of the buildings. And so that was a really fantastic way to sort of wind things up that particular summer. And we got our group photo there in front of the Basilica facade. So again, kind of a nice bonus. That summer, we also had, as our guest tour that summer, instead of Joanne Sporza, who wasn't able to be in Rome that summer, we had Genevieve Gessert, who was the incoming summer school director for the next year. And she took us around Ostia, and we were joined by Kathy Gefkin, and I hope she won't get mad at me for having photos of her there, but was so pleased that we had her along. And I snapped photos surreptitiously of her. But I have to say, Kathy is someone that I see almost every summer that I'm here, and we have wonderful conversations after lunch, and she is one of the things that I cherish about, you know, having met her in 1989 and then gone several years before seeing her again, and then just every summer having the chance to meet up with her again and talk with her. It's just always such a joy. So that is another of the benefits there. But in terms of sort of the lasting impact, one of the things that I will say is that, you know, it brings the lasting impact of the classical summer school as I see it and its influence on my career and all is this. First of all, it brings together teachers and graduate students with experienced scholars, the people who are the directors, the people who are the fellows at the academy, the artists at the academy, anybody who's, you know, kind of co-opted in to do a tour. They get the benefit of all of this wonderful experience. This photo, by the way, was taken by Corey Brennan in 2011, so I thank him for having shared it with me. The participation in the academy community was really directly influential, as I said, to my applying for a Rome Prize. And all of these experiences, the summer school, the Rome Prize, everything has really led to lasting professional and personal friendships that I have now. In universities, we talk very often about gateway courses that will, you know, we hope lead students to further, deeper study in a particular area and maybe even get them to major, you know, in our field or something. And I think the classical summer school really is a gateway course. It is something that has, no matter at what stage, whether it's early career, mid-career, or even a little later, as sometimes happens with some of the teachers who come, it tends to be a very, you know, strong experience for them. And as an assistant for the program and as director of the program, I know I've taught at least 100 students doing this. And the majority, I think, would agree that the Classical Summer School was a formative and transformative experience in many cases. In my own case, it introduced me, as I said, to Roman topography as a subfield of the discipline of classics. I'd had a kind of classroom seminar course on it, but never this, walk the streets and get to know it in that way sort of course. And so for me, it was important. It taught me about the sources that are available. It also taught me about the skill sets, such as the autoptic exercise, that are needed to evaluate things. It also taught me about the mix of materials, how text and material culture are intertwined, and for topography, how you need to even look beyond the ancient world to develop the whole picture of a site or a monument in Rome, that you need to look at the medieval sources, the Renaissance sources, modern archaeology, obviously, but that there's a whole, range of materials and time periods that you need to look at. And so all of this is what really led me to Severe in Rome and to the marvels of really puzzling through problems of Roman topography, thinking about the city as it appeared at different points in time and how people interacted with it. And so I have to say that's my experience, my thoughts, and I could probably go on forever, but I will let you go now and pass the baton on to the next speaker. And I will thank you, not part of the summer school, but one of my favorite things to get to see in Rome.
Thank you, Suzanne. Our next speaker is Lisa Marie Mignone, a 2007 fellow and classical summer school assistant, also in 2007, and research affiliate at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University, and also an associate professor adjunct at Columbia University. And her talk is entitled Regeneration, the Energizing Effect of Processing Through Rome, 207 BCE to 2007 CE. Lisa.
Hi, it's great to be here. My talk is going to be a very intense 20 minutes because this classical summer school is intense. Imagine the year 207 BCE, war with Hannibal's raging throughout the western and central Mediterranean. Hannibal has crossed over the Alps into the peninsula, and Rome has already suffered its series of devastating defeats. Trasimene in 2000, I can't even get my years right anymore, in 217 BCE, where 25,000 Romans were killed or captured. Trebia in 218, where 20,000 Romans have been killed and more captured, and most brutally Cannae in August of 216, where casualty numbers rose to 48,200 killed and 19,300 captured. Of course, these numbers are funny. Ancient historians have often debated the collective demographic, ecological, and agrarian impacts of the events. One of my interests is the psychological and spiritual impacts. How does a community take in that sort of violence, defeat, and death, and reconsolidate their collectivity, transform their collective sorrow, and mobilize militarily? In particular, I was supposed to talk about my current research. I'm looking at how they use religion to rally their spirits and regain divine support. The intensity and frequency of religious activity increased substantially during the Punic Wars, as Roman religious and political authorities demonstrated their eagerness to exploit all possible avenues of religious rite. There was greater simultaneous and coordinated involvement of a full range of religious officials, pontiffs, augurs, decemvirs, haruspices, and vestals. And in addition to the maintenance of customary sacrifices and festivals to the gods, the period of 218 to 202 featured increased consultation of oracles, performance of obsacrationes and supplicationes, these are different sorts of public prayers, offerings of first fruits, full-grown victims, statues, and gold, importation of foreign gods, and even human sacrifice. This was an intense time of ritual activity. The Hannibalic War was the largest war Rome had ever engaged in, certainly the deadliest for the Romans themselves to that point, and Rome was prepared to marshal all resources in its defense, religious as well as military. I'm working on the extraordinary worship of Juno at Rome during the Punic Wars, including a spectacular expiatory procession through the streets of Rome in the year 207 BCE. This parade remains one of the most fully described in Republican literature, but least studied in modern scholarship. The Romans carried out the procession specifically as an attempt to expiate divine wrath that had manifested itself in three major signs: the series of aforementioned horrific Roman military defeats, the birth of an androgynous child of prodigious proportions, a child born the size of a 4-year-old whose sex could not be determined, and a lightning strike to the very temple of Aventine Juno. The Romans interpreted the second, the abnormal birth, as a warning that nature was being corroded, and amidst the countless deaths of the grave military failures, regeneration was threatened. The third sign indicated the destination of the worship and the goddess who required propitiation. The Romans took these signs very seriously. The procession coordinated a broad range of Roman religious authorities and female worshippers. Livy scripts it as the turning point of the Second Punic War. If you read his history, this procession is the turning point. And some historical evidence authenticates the procession's perceived historical extra-literary impact. At the lowest point in the Second Punic War, this parade through Rome kinetically wove Juno's Aventine sanctuary into the religious cityscape of the Caput Mundi. Ritual expiation not only integrated the Aventine, Juno Regina, formerly of Veii, as the terminus and culmination of reactivated Roman triumphal patterns and ideologies. Sorry, I think I skipped a sentence. Not only integrated the Aventine into the religious texture of Rome, but also as the terminus and culmination of reactivated Roman triumphal patterns and ideologies. With Juno properly worshipped, Roman victory became increasingly assured. Within the nexus of goals and meanings of the procession of 207 was the revival of memories of Roman victory and military success. From its starting point to the moment the processional route swings up to the Aventine, it follows, Pace Mary Beard, the pathways of the Roman triumph, the great Roman pageants that paraded the glories of Roman imperialism through the city streets. Prisoners of war, some to live on as enslaved, others to be executed, looted works of art, treasures and monetary wealth, the carousing army and the victorious general himself. The procession of 207, however, was no triumph. It largely followed that route, though. With the passing of each past triumphal monument, old manubial temples and victory cults, the procession itself must have served as a petition for Roman military supremacy. The movement, particularly of the thrice 9 maidens, also connected areas celebrating youthful vigor and procreation, such as the shrine of the Porta Carmentalis and the twin temples of Fortuna and Mater Matuta. These are the spiritual domains with which Juno herself was likewise associated. The Temple of Aventine Juno served as the final destination and capstone of the procession, and it was at Juno Regina's sanctuary that all these religious, imperial, and triumphal associations came together and made sense. Within months, Hannibal's brother was defeated and decapitated, and so were Hannibal's hopes. The tide had turned towards Roman victory. The so-called Battle of Zama in 202 left Hannibal and his Carthaginians with no other tenable option than peace on Rome's terms. Now, it's this sort of phenomenological and kinetic engagement with Rome's space and its proverbial memory theater I try to engage whenever I come here, just as walking through that procession of 207 brought back all the memories of past triumphs, engaged all the temples. This is the sort of experience I'm hoping to have when I come to Rome. And it's something one simply cannot get anywhere else. This is what we all always talk about. You have to move through the city. You have to experience it. You have to listen to it. You have to walk it. You have to feel it. You have to eat it, right? One cannot understand these spatial relationships when sitting in a silent library. One cannot perceive it when looking at maps and plans. Moving through the city, even the modern city, is essential. And this is exactly the point Ethel Chubb, who is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome in 1921, advocated in a piece published in Classical Weekly 100 years ago. So this came out in October of 1923, and considering pipelines of publication, right, This is right when the classical summer school was inaugurated, just getting its start. And I'll return to Chubb subsequently. Integration of ancient history and literature into cityscape, ancient and modern, is not something I understood through annual family trips to my Zia Italia's apartment outside the Porta Pia. And there you can even see little Roberto Mignone holding a Rome book. I said it's a little bit like wearing a Taylor Swift t-shirt to a Taylor Swift concert, having your Rome guidebook. And I am the baby in my father's arms there. So this is not something I learned on family trips, but through continuous research for the past 27 years. From my time as a sophomore on semester abroad at the Centro in spring of 1996 to my stint as a student at the since culled and now no longer existent American Academy Summer Program in Archaeology, which was co-directed by Lisa Fentress, Darby Scott, and John Dobbins. Very influential experience to my intellectual development. To the 2006 summer, I assisted the NEH seminar on Trajan's Column, Narratives of War, Civilization, and Commemoration in the Roman Empire. To that time, when I was Miles' assistente for the American Academy's Classical Summer School. These are a few of the key moments that don't just credentialize my speaking here today, but also provide the context and backdrop for my thoughts on how important the Classical Summer School has been for the past century, continues to be in the present, and one must advocate will be for another century. There's simply no way to engage the history of the city without being in the city, and few programs offer anything comparable to the American Academy of Rome's Classical Summer School itself. While there's no shortage of American students in Italy at any given time, and there have been several summer schools that are well established, like that of SUNY Stony Brook, which Mario Mignone directed for half a century or more, and new summer programs spring up regularly, none of these compare to the program offered by the American Academy in Rome. Weeks of immediate and direct engagement, specifically with ancient sites throughout the central Italian peninsula, led by extraordinary and attentive experts, and offering the opportunity for personal inquiry and development through site reports and presentations. This is no summer sightseeing vacation, but an intense, intellectual, transformative experience across 26 or more centuries of history in a major European capital and nation, while surrounded, when the AAR is accessible and the fellows inviting, by brilliant artists as well. In particular, I want to celebrate how absolutely essential the Classical Summer School is for school teachers. And I'm sure there are several of you in the audience right now, and you're going to be widely applauded throughout the rest of my talk. How essential it is for school teachers, and through them, the future of Roman antiquity, as well as the field of scholarly inquiry. So several weeks ago, I turned to social media to request opinions and memories of the Classical Summer School. The responses that struck me the most were those of well-established scholars whose high school teachers had participated in the summer school. So John Van Sickle, you see in the upper right, is a literary scholar of the pastoral tradition and began his career at Brooklyn College in 1976. We must bear in mind that Brooklyn College, and he's still a professor there, Brooklyn College, as part of the City University of New York, is a public university offering outstanding classics education to an underserved community of upwardly mobile intellectuals. John wrote that his Latin teacher, Anna Drybush, studied under Henry Rowell. Rowell was director of the summer school from 1937 to 1939 when he was an assistant professor at Yale, and then 1947 to 1948, and 1950 to 1951 when he was chair at Johns Hopkins. Judy Hallett, a pioneer in feminist classical studies and now professor emeritus at University of Maryland, another public school, reports that her own middle school Latin teacher was Ruth Rosenberg Ehrlich, who had studied at Bryn Mawr and Penn. Ehrlich, in turn, had studied at Girls High in Pennsylvania under Ethel Chubb, a fellow in 1921, whose words we've already seen. She had promoted the establishment of the Classical Summer School, and we just saw the conclusion to her piece. Lisa Fentress, who's actually in the audience, I didn't expect her, renowned archaeologist, former Mellon professor, and an Academy icon, remembers how her Latin teacher came from the Classical Summer School, quote, flowing actual tears in her eyes, end quote. Lisa adds, first I ever heard of the AAR. These high school teachers introduced the next generation of scholars to whom we are all indebted as scholars, to what the academy was, right? Without them, without these high school teachers who had gone to the summer school, our trajectories would have been very different. It is stunning to think how the experience of school teachers as participants in the classical summer school has not only enriched their personal engagement with Rome and with classical antiquity, but also transformed their teaching itself. School teachers are foundational to the perpetuation of the study of classical antiquity, and continuing to offer access to them must remain a top priority. Now, there's also been a lot of talk about diversity and equity in academia, in classics in particular, and at the American Academy in Rome itself. And if we are truly dedicated to this enterprise, then outreach and inclusion must be practiced actively and insistently, and not just as scholars inside the paywall. And I'll return to that point. Here I hand my talk over entirely to Danielle Nunez, one of the summer school participants in 2007, and this is her testimonial she sent me. Okay, quote, "At the AAR, I was surrounded by accomplished people, veteran teachers, graduate students, and professors. I, myself, was an accidental Latin teacher at a large public school in Harlem, woefully unqualified, but thrilled by the opportunity to improve my education and hone my craft. At the AAR, I was anxious about my imposter status, but the community around me was incredibly supportive, united in love of the discipline. The curriculum was like nothing I'd experienced before. Nightly readings prepared us for daily field trips to places of literary and historical importance. We matched landscapes and city plans to their descriptions in ancient texts. The ancient world felt accessible to me for the first time. When I was a high school student, I had taken Latin for 2 requisite years, but I never felt that classics was, quote, for me, end quote. It had felt alien and rarefied, and it was an easy decision to drop it after my sophomore year. 10 years later at the AAR, I formed a totally new connection to classical studies. My AAR experience helped me to become a more confident and committed classicist. That confidence transferred onto my own students. They had a teacher they believed in and one who believed in herself. After the AAR, I continued my education in classics, completing more than a dozen courses in the years that followed. I pursued language intensives and literature courses at Hunter College, the Latin Greek Institute at Brooklyn College, and at the University College Cork. I also registered for workshops for the AP Latin curriculum. I was invited by the classics department at Princeton University, my alma mater, to sit on a panel called Careers in Classics, to discuss my experience as a public school teacher in New York City. I continue to teach in the public schools of New York City, where I'm currently one of 7 Latin teachers at the Brooklyn Latin School, a specialized high school with a classics-based IB curriculum. I believe that my experience at the American Academy in Rome was a foundation for my career as a Latin teacher. It showed me my place and my potential in classics. I will be forever grateful to that experience." And that's the end of her testimonial. The classical summer school transformed not only Danielle as a student, scholar, teacher, and classicist, but also the experiences, the lives, and the education of her students. The pictures she sent me show her students at the Villa Virgiliana in Boccoli, which right now, incidentally, is hosting a world-class multi-day conference on Virgil and the Roman Republic. Imagine being one of her Harlem High School students and thinking, I stayed at the same villa where all these great scholars of classics are staying. We also see Pestum, a field trip to the recent Chroma show at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, and also a little bit far from Rome, Aphrodisias. Danielle should be the one speaking here today, not me. I'm glad to be able to share her words. The impact the summer school had on my research, me, Lisa Mignone, is a limited and somewhat esoteric discussion. Danielle is actively introducing new waves of students to classical worlds, Greek, Roman, and well beyond. She shared these photos of her students in Machu Picchu and the Great Wall of China. The sort of education the classical summer school provides is in no way limited to the Roman republicans, emperors, and early church fathers. The skills one develops in reading plans and maps, in lecturing on site, in engaging the landscape and seeing how space influences action, how actions create and define space. These are universal, and transferable concepts that participants in the summer school learn, develop, and transfer into countless other contexts, and bring their students along for the ride. The more those students are pre-college, the more the students are teaching are pre-college, and the wider the socioeconomic and demographic range of those students, the more enriched and healthier, the more generative and regenerated the study of classical antiquity will continue to be, to the greater glory of the American Academy in Rome itself. At present, as far as I know, there is no other program the American Academy in Rome offers that performs this sort of outreach to communities that aren't already the established artistic and intellectual elite. The Academy does an excellent job at embellishing resumes for the fellows and residents who have already passed through a fairly rigorous application and interview process. The Academy at its best helps build networks between those artists and scholars with the broader community in Rome and beyond. The Classical Summer School is the only program I know of that the AAR has offered that performs any sort of outreach and development, and in particular to any sort of underserved community, in which, yes, I include school teachers who face a tremendous amount of discrimination from the intellectual and artistic elite, and who deserve far more funding and support than they generally have at their disposal. And now, I move into the realm of fantasy and science fiction. What I think would be phenomenal would be to expand the program if we could have a second session, maintain the first session, as is for high school teachers and graduate students of Greco-Roman antiquity, and then offer a second session as an outreach session for Romance language teachers, social studies teachers, art teachers, along with architects, composers, landscape architects, poets, sculptors, and painters, the best of the Academy, right? A hybrid version that offered the best of the Academy fellowship with the outreach for social teachers, for school teachers. This was precisely the point Ethel Chubb was making when she wrote about the proposed summer school the year it was established, the very best of Rome at a time of year available to a wide range of potential participants. When I was the assistant director in 2007, my co-fellow, the visual artist Patricia Cronin, attended 2 field trips with us, to Sperlonga and to the Mithraeum under Santa Prisca on the Aventine. While the formal summer school presentations expanded Patty's understanding of culture and religious interactions in the Mediterranean, aesthetic choices and contexts and social hierarchies, Patty transformed the way I look at art production and the way the students look at art production. I got 1 minute left. All right, so I'm going to skip what she achieved because I want to skip to this last point. Sorry, artists. Okay, classics now. The point about that is how important it is to integrate all the fellows and how much we have to learn from each other. Classics right now is at a dangerous moment, atrophying through defunding and conscientious disinterest, while simultaneously growing through co-optation by misinformed enthusiasts, some of them extraordinarily wealthy, vocal, accessible, and just wrong. At my recent 25th college reunion, our class marshal, Sewell Chan, who you see on the right with his father, delivered a speech that left an indelible mark on my thoughts. Sewell is editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, a nonprofit politics and public policy news website that aims to, quote, help bring about a healthier, better educated, more productive, more prosperous, and more equitable Texas, end quote. While Sewell's work is that of a journalist, this sort of mission is achieved through education, of which we can perhaps see journalism as some sort of an extension. What was it that Sewell said? What does it have to do with the CSS? He raised the issue that in general, today, there is a glut of misinformation, misdirection, fake news, conspiracy theories, all readily available, while legitimate news sources are locked behind paywalls. As Prigozhin marched towards Moscow just the other day, classicists immediately drew parallels with Sulla's march on Rome, while journalists questioned whether a Caesarian Prigozhin had crossed the Rubicon. Shall we ask Elon Musk whether Putin is the original Nero, whoever that is? Perhaps Prigozhin is Musk's Hannibal, now retreating to his Provinkia of Belarus. Playing these games of parallels is easy, quick, fast, and usually wrong. They're also often freely accessible. Education locked behind paywalls, while misinformation freely circulates, should hit all of us hard. The more we can act and conscientiously advocate for accessibility to high-level intellectual engagement, to kinetic education, to the phenomenological engagement of underserved practitioners, of the teachers. The more we work towards securing the future of our discipline as classicists, historians, archaeologists, and architectural historians, the more, too, we reinforce the foundational mission and goals of the American Academy in Rome. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you for that really important intervention. Absolutely. Our next speaker is Ingrid Rowland, a 1982 fellow, a 2000 resident, and classical summer school participant in 1975. Ingrid is also a faculty member in the Department of History and the Department of Classics at the University of Rome, formerly the University of Notre Dame in Rome, formerly the University of Notre Dame Global Gateway. And her talk is entitled Unintended Consequences. Welcome, Ingrid.
There's the title. Everybody's experience of the classical summer school is intense, often life-changing. It opens gates. In my own case, on day one, in an extracurricular walk down the hill, it opened an unexpected gate and changed my life. Some of it has to do with being 21. I was 21, I turned 22 while I was there. It happens to be a time that your brain processes information for the first time in a more articulate way. I read somewhere you can't teach tragedy to 17-year-olds because their brains don't wire it up. And in fact, when I was at Chicago, I had to teach tragedy by saying, if you use the tragic flaw, I will flunk you. And that was caprice of the gods, and they could understand caprice of the professor and sort of think about the tragedy that as 21-year-olds they would begin to grasp. And so in a way, the classical summer school is like Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, where I'd ask my students all the time, who's being called? And they'll try to figure it out. And of course, we're all being called. Whether or not we do it, or we answer the call is something. And in my own case, the call was like what happened to one of my students looking at that paintings. I've had 3 occasions where I can think of students who are hanging around the back of the class as we go around Rome, and then suddenly something clicks, and you could just see their face. They're absolutely riveted, and everything changes. When I came to the classical summer school, I was a first-year graduate, or I'd finished my first year at Bryn Mawr College in Greek, thought I'd seen everything. My classmate Ann Wise had just been on the Academy Summer School, and she said, it won't be as great as your summer school in Athens, but it's okay. And so here's Athens in 1973. I realized with great horror that is exactly 50 years ago. But what can you do? And this is the dirty city with bell-bottoms and funny clothing and funny cars that I remember. And I thought I'd found perfect bliss. This is what we all looked like. We were hairy, we were skinny, we had bell-bottoms. And you'll notice that the feed before of photographs from previous summer sessions didn't show us because we looked so embarrassing. But there you've got Jack Freiberg and me in front of a fascist poster before we knew that we were standing in front of an Almirante poster. And so it's just one of those things. This is the kind of creature that fell upon filthy Rome. Darby Scott was our professor. Bernie Fisher was the assistant, and he decided to take a bunch of us down to the Campus Martius for an ice cream. And so we walked by Giordano Bruno's statue, which I knew from Bertolt Brecht's story. And so that lodged in my tiny brain. And I saw a couple of days later in the late lamented Croce bookstore this book about Giordano Bruno by somebody named Yeats. I didn't know anything about who Yeats was. I would find out that Frances Yates was one of the most persuasive writers imaginable. She worked at the Warburg Institute in England and unlocked these secrets of the ancient art of memory, but then applied them to people like Giordano Bruno and another crazy guy named Athanasius Kircher, whom I first heard of from her. And then we went on to Piazza Navona, looked at the Fountain of the Four Rivers. Bernie was describing the different rivers, and I was standing there, and I realized that we were on the receiving end of a horse. And everything in me wanted to say, and there's the horse's ass, but I couldn't say, and there's the horse's ass, because I had just met this person, this is my teacher. Many years later, I could have said it, and he would have laughed his head off, but we didn't know each other well enough to make the joke that would have been hilarious. And in fact, when Piranesi does his engraving of Piazza Navona, he switches the posterior of the horse and instead has the thirsty lion drinking. That's in fact over pointing towards Palazzo Medici instead. And the front of the horse is smiling at Donna Olimpia Maidalchini in Palazzo Pamphili. And this is where I learned about urban placement of animals, which is very important for the pointing of the elephant who's carrying the obelisk in front of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, where the only thing you can do is the prior of the Dominican order must take the rear end of the elephant and offer it to the public, because every other side of the piazza you have to be nice to. There's the public on two sides and Our Lady on the third, and so the only place that the elephant can point himself is where he's pointing himself now. Then we moved on to this place by a guy I didn't know named Borromini called Sant Ivo. And something happened to me when I saw that, and I just realized, first of all, architecture can talk to you. Second of all, that dome was going from convex to concave. And number three, my life had to change. I needed that. I didn't know how I needed it. I didn't know where it was going to fit. But it was the first moment where I got one of the great gifts that I've learned as a teacher for many years of architects, scholars get. We are inculcated with the idea of making reasonable arguments from evidence. And what that does is give us a mighty weapon for understanding the world, which my architecture students don't get. And so I have to teach them something about argumentation from evidence. And he's a great way to do it, because basically what Borromini's doing is marshaling visual evidence to take you someplace, because you can't walk into that church without going like this. And so suddenly my brain was on fire. It led to my reading Paolo Portughese's Borromini book as soon as I got back from Rome. And I made a fortress in my study carrel at Bryn Mawr of works on Baroque architecture. And I actually met Paolo Portughese 2 years later when I came to the American Academy as a visiting scholar. And I had two things I wanted to do. I can't remember. One of them was meet Paolo Portughese. I could barely speak Italian, but he ended up taking 6 of us to Sant Ivo, and he said there was a linea ideale, and we all... He helped me write in an articulate manner, because what he could do with the classical elements of Italian was use them in the way that he thought Borromini was using the elements of architecture to make a kind of rhetorical argument. And so this too started changing things. I'm having a traffic jam with advancing. Can you go back? Oh, I'm completely traffic jammed. Yeah, it's the PowerPoint moment. When I was working here as Mellon professor, the head of programs, that's great. Okay. And that one. 3 weeks into my job, Carolyn Howard said, "You need to meet my husband, Eugenio Losardo." Here he is inside San Ivo in the Archivio di Stato, and he's become one of my best friends. So, okay, I've written a book on Giordano Bruno. I've written a book on Athanasius Kircher. And so all of these inchoate insights of a 21-year-old brain turned into something that doesn't happen overnight. But what it really means is that the classical summer school opens up all of Rome, not just classical Rome. And classical Rome made sense out of Baroque Rome. Baroque Rome made sense out of classical Rome. Eventually, my range now goes from the Etruscans to contemporary art. And all of it really was forged in a week in 1975. By the end of the week, I went to the Vatican museums. I knew I loved the School of Athens because it showed, but what I saw there was also a strategy for my own life. Because Raphael's Parnassus, right next to the School of Athens, had Homer singing with Virgil and Dante listening. And I'd been reading Dante before I came on the summer session. And so what I knew is that I, in 1975, knew what this man in 1511 was thinking about these three people, and I could quote them so that I knew what they were saying, and suddenly the Renaissance and its involvement with antiquity hit me physically instead of intellectually. So it's the same thing that we've been talking about. When you immerse yourself in something, suddenly it changes. Same thing for the filthy Sistine Chapel. I thought I'd seen everything with the School of Athens. I was weeping. I thought, yeah, Michelangelo. And then, of course, burst into tears in the Sistine Chapel. And I wanted to work on Renaissance Rome, which I have. And to my immense good fortune, when I came back to Bryn Mawr with Rome in my brain and not wanting to be anywhere else, Phyllis Bober offered a course called Antiquity in the Renaissance. And so I could see, you could eat Italian food, you could look at Raphael, and you could still read Greek, and you could call it a life. It didn't fit into any department. There were not yet reception studies, and the usual term that was used for my response to all this was insanity, but that was all right because Plato tells us that the insane can see things. And so I was at a crossroads. This is the Hecate in Samothrace that I jumped the fence to see in 1976 when I was at the American School. And the crossroads was, do I go on in classics with Sophocles' Philoctetes and be a ragged hero? Or do I work on the richest man in Renaissance Rome who died in his bed when Machiavelli was in exile, whose first letter to his father says, I just told Cesare Borgia I'd give him 3,000 ducats. Please send money, Dad. And then he says, or I might die, or worse, I'd be the most shamed man in the world. And so I decided to take Agostino Chigi as my role model rather than poor Philoctetes for the time being. And then the whole thing is, how do you get a job? It's like walking down the side of the Pantheon, which we did in 1975. And so in order to cobble this kind of life together, if you're a woman scholar in 1980, you really have to be extremely flexible. So I've taught in classics departments, I've taught art history, I've taught architecture, and as my colleague Wayne Booth at Chicago said, read it, hell, I haven't even taught it. And I think what my experience shows is the need for community in this wonderful drawing where this is the way I'm trying now to rewrite the history of classical architecture, which is my next big project, where I want it to be families instead of orders, because orders were invented by Raphael in 1519. And families have leeway. You can be different. You could be quirky, but you still belong in your own way. And I think that's probably what I'm on this earth to do, is tell you there's a broad way in which you can still be a good classicist. It wasn't really practical for somebody with my propensities just to work on the Etruscans, though I loved them. But the field of Etruscan forgery was wide open. And so that was a good way to get in it. And then the great second moment in my life is when Robert Silvers of the New York Review of Books read something that I'd written and said, "You want to write?" And so once I'm working with Bob, first of all, you have Bob take care of the way you write, and then you can say, "I'm a writer." And if you say you're a writer, you can write about anything. And it ends up giving you great freedom, and it means I can do Greek. I could go to Syracuse, which is Greece, and see Greek plays and write about them. And I could see Giuseppe Sartori and Maddalena Crippa doing the most amazing Oedipus. It was worth getting COVID watching it. It really was. We all decided. And so, I think the summer school has an infinite potential in many, many fields. And so the whole idea of the American Academy was that you don't have to have boundaries. And I think that's correct.
Thank you, Ingrid, for reminding us of the flexibility of the human mind. And, you know, we have a few more speeches, but already this has been a beautiful invocation of the importance of the classics, of the importance of the humanities, of the importance of scholarship, learning, inspiration. So I'm feeling inspired. Next, we have Sanjaya Thakur, our current director of the Classical Summer School. Sanjaya was a participant in 2006 and has been director since 2021. And he is also professor of classics and the Judson Bemis Professor of the Humanities at Colorado Colleges. And welcome to the podium, Sanjaya. Oh, I didn't read the title, but the title is up.
Thank you very much, Marla. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to celebrate the CSS Centennial with a few comments on how the program has affected my scholarship and career. And let me add how wonderful it is to see many friends and colleagues here and to know many others who are tuning in from the United States. So to those, good afternoon, good morning, and thank you for attending virtually. I entitled my talk Memories, Reflections, and Scholarship, so let me begin with some memories. I have many from the summer of 2006. My cohort, many of whom I'm still in contact with, our director, Miles McDonnell, my fellow Wolverine, Assistant Hendrik Day, the heat, the wonderful conversations, amazing sights and access, the heat. But if forced to pick only one, it would be this. Watching the World Cup final from the Spina in the Circus Maximus with a couple of my CSS program mates. We arrived early there to grab a great spot, and we were joined by tens and tens of thousands, which would grow then to hundreds of thousands who flooded the city center after the game. Chris Copley, on the right, and myself still reminisce about our triumphal procession that night, walking after the game with what seemed like all of Rome, From the circus over to the Arch of Constantine, along the Foro de Imperiale to the Piazza Venezia, where people had climbed everywhere and chants of Italia, Italia rang all night long. At about 5 or 6 in the morning, Chris and I walked back to Monteverde, and I cannot do justice in describing the scene. Cars literally filling every space on the road and sidewalk, strewn all about as if in some disaster or post-apocalyptic movie. Buses were parked sideways, doors were open, even the bridges were full of cars. Who knows how long it took to clear it all out? I had actually forgotten what fell on the next day of our itinerary, and so I had to check my files, but it was actually scheduled as an off day. I don't know if this was Hendrik's influence or not, Miles. You could maybe tell us. But I'm fairly certain it marks the last time I took the stairs up to the AAR from Trastevere. I had applied for the 2006 CSS after spending the 2004-2005 academic year in Athens as a Fulbright Fellow and engaging in much of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens travel program. It was that experience which made me fully realize the ability of organizations like the AAR to access sites and how great it was to be led by scholars and experts on a particular site or topic. I had already begun work on my dissertation, which, being on Ovid, meant that I was engaged with monuments and spaces in Rome. And I was also completing a second master's degree in classical art and archaeology, much of which centered on Roman topography. So I had a good idea of what I wanted to see, and I knew that the CSS was the easiest and best way to do it. The program was a bit different then. It was a week longer, the cohort a bit bigger, and most participants pre-collegiate teachers who came through the support of the Fulbright program. And I had been a former high school teacher before I started my graduate career, so I sort of fit in quite well, I think, between those groups. But the itinerary rigor and goals were similar then as now. To learn more about the city of Rome and its development with an emphasis on on-site learning, and I still use many of the picks that I took that summer, this being one of them. And I remember being especially excited, here's another, by our guest speakers, such as Eleanor Windsor-Leach, Kathy Gefkin, Lisa Fentress, Elizabeth Bartman, Eileen Naj, Joanne Spurza, Ann Kuttner, Darby Scott, the list goes on, and some of whom are here with us today. And the access was all that I imagined. Here are some of the shots from places we no longer visit, sadly. The first here from the Horologium, and the second one, like we've seen before, from climbing atop Trajan's column. The impact of this program on the careers of so many classicists is noteworthy, and I can't sort of supersede the words that Lisa provided and the quotations that she gave from former participants, so I won't even try. But suffice it to say, I echo everything that she said. The course helped me prepare to teach my own courses abroad, something which I've now done for 12 years at Colorado College, and no doubt appealed to many in-job searches, when I was on the job market. As I'm already bleeding into reflections, let me transition there formally. When applying for the position of director several years ago now, it gave me the occasion for a focused look back on my experience as a CSS participant. In my application, interview, and post-selection as director, I had a vision of what I wanted to do. Many items I think would be common refrains from any director. To see as much of the city as we can while we're together. To gain as many special permessi to sites and museums as we can. To have colleagues come and join and share their expertise and passion. And perhaps more than other directors, to revisit certain sites and museums multiple times to try to master those particular locations and not have to cover them in too frenetic a way. That always seems to be how it ends up. And finally, in selecting cohorts, I wanted to prioritize access and diversity in many forms. And I don't simply mean racial or ethnic, but career path, stage of career, subdiscipline, historical period, etc. Engage with this year's wonderful participants who are here, and you'll see what I mean. Being chosen director gave me the chance to review my experience in detail and speak with those from my cohort and from other years. That was a great experience in and of itself. I also quickly went through my files and found all my handouts and notes and reviewed those. I sought advice from Miles and Suzanne, both who kindly shared PDFs and advice and images, Gretchen Myers kindly shared all of her PDFs of the readings that she assigned. Jim Anderson provided words of inspiration, as did many other professors around the country. Now, when I interviewed for the position, a portion of the discussion centered around this, the 100th anniversary of the CSS. Little did any of us know that this would not be the major event to occur during my directorship. COVID canceled the 2020 session when I was scheduled to shadow Gretchen for a portion of the time. Throughout 2021, we put in hours and hours of planning and accepting applications, only for the situation not to improve in time, and so for the second straight year, the session was canceled. Finally, last year, we were able to resume the program. But COVID also provided opportunities. Though the 2021 session was canceled, I was able to come to Rome in the summer when few others were. My most vivid memory is walking by the Forum on a Sunday, Saturday morning at 11 o'clock and counting only 7 people in the Central Forum area. These are shots from the Vatican that'll give you some idea of how, quiet it was. This is an 11 a.m. entry in the Vatican. I remember thinking, indeed, the sarcophagus of Scipio, which is to my right there, does exist. I now rue the fact I've never seen the floor before or since, and I will never experience anything like this again in my life. Tourism was low, and so I was afforded amazing opportunities to explore the city and meet with leading staff at sites and museums who often took me around personally as I prepared for future CSS visits. I think because people were excited to see some other person there. This is a good point to transition to the final portion of my talk, scholarship. Site visits, like my participation in the program, have inspired my scholarship throughout my career and align with my predilection of situating literary texts in a broader milieu of monuments and artistic productions. In the summer of 2021, Dan Diffendale, a 2020 AAR fellow, joined me out for a trip to Tivoli, where we stopped at the mausoleum of the Plautii at Ponte Lugano. There, I saw some fascinating inscriptions, which have inspired me which inspired ongoing work on the family who built that magnificent tomb and focusing on the female members in the house. But it's this slide that I want to spend the rest of my time with today. It's from a display in the markets of Trajan, but it was originally part of the Forum of Augustus. The Forum Augustum was one of the central monuments of the Augustan building program. It was dedicated in 2 BC, and at its center was a temple dedicated to Mars Ultor. In its niches held statues of the Sumiwiri, and its centerpiece was an equestrian statue of Augustus. These monuments have been the subjects of much scholarly work, but the architectural and artistic features of the vaulted attic level, which was located atop a covered portico that ran along the length of both sides of the Forum, have received far less attention. The facade of this upper story was decorated with caryatid columns, and the intercolumnar areas were filled with large relief panels, often referred to as clippae, of which 2 types survive. They are images of Jupiter Ammon and of a barbarian. Scholars have struggled to make sense of any programmatic connection between the various images and have only offered limited theories on individual elements. And though there's an image of Jupiter Ammon's Clypeus in Zonker's 1968 publication on the Forum Augustum, it's only in recent times that the display in Trajan's markets was set up. But there, the remains are very fragmentary, especially of the Ammon figure. And I think the Ammon image remains rather unknown. But I had seen the Ammon image during the CSS, for one copy is in the offices of the House of the Knights of Rhodes. A current project that I am undertaking relates this image to an episode that occurs in Ovid's Metamorphoses, arguing the poet draws on Roman iconography from this most Augustan of spaces as he closes Book 15. I argue that to Romans of Ovid's day, the mention of a horned figure in the Chippus episode, Book 15, lines 565 to 621, would call to mind this image in the Forum, and thus affect how they interpret the story. Now let me be clear. I'm not arguing that the Chippus story in Ovid is a or the direct and sole reference readers are directed to recall. Rather, that it would be an image that would likely come to a reader's mind, and thus they might associate this image with the episode. This distinction is important because I imagine a similar process at work in many episodes of the epic, where experience of and in the city colors the perception and interpretation of many, if not most, myths. Admittedly, that's a rather bold thesis, but it's one I actually plan to spend the rest of my career working on. The Chippus episode is not a well-known one, so here's a very quick summary. Chippus is mentioned by Pliny and Valerius Maximus, but in the Ovidian version, he is a praetor who grows horns on his head. He is then prophesied to rule Rome as a king if he enters the city. But Chippus does not want such power. So he calls together the Roman people, hiding his horns with a crown, and tells them that they must reject a figure who appears to them with horns, for he will enslave them and rule them like a tyrant. Then Chippus dramatically reveals the figure to be himself. He is given land outside the city, and horns are engraved on the gate where he delivered the speech, supposedly appearing even in Ovid's day. The Chippus episode in Ovid's Metamorphoses has been the subject of limited inquiry. Karl Galinsky offers the most extensive discussion, concluding that Chippus should be read as an anti-Augustus figure who declines tyrannical power that Augustus assumes. Galinsky later softened his tone about the Metamorphoses in general, dismissing the continued use of the term anti-Augustan, but he does remain committed to reading the Chippus episode as containing, and I quote, subtle ironic allusions to Augustus. Though other attempts have been made to view the episode as a commentary on the Augustan political situation of Ovid's day, no one has described in detail any connections between the elements in the episode and the topography of Augustan Rome or Augustan art in the city. I first made this proposal that Ovid's description of Chippus would call to mind the images of Jupiter Ammon in the Forum of Augustus in a brief note in a JRA review about a decade ago. Philip Hardy makes an equally brief mention in his Italian Met commentary, but no one has argued in detail how the iconography further facilitates a visual relationship of reading Augustus as a Chippus-like figure and how that might affect readings of the episode. Scholars have noted Ovid's interaction with his literary predecessors, especially Virgil, and a number of commented on topographic allusions to places such as Augustus's home and Temple of Apollo on the Palatine. Few have commented on the personal potential relationships to this prominent but smaller scale element in the city, or elements more generally. But it is an Ovidian reference to a prominent Augustan civic space that would tie this somewhat obscure episode into those near the end of the epic, in which many have seen references to Augustus, leading to the apotheosis of Caesar at the end of the poem. Augustus's intentions for the Ammon image are debated. Lucrezia Ungaro provides some theories in her publications. There is, of course, the Ammon image's relationship with the broader Augustan trope of co-opting Greek culture and history into the Roman world. And one particular fact the Ammon image was surely intended to recall was Alexander the Great's relationship with the deity. Before his passing, Andy Stewart and I had several conversations about possible reference in both the Ammon and the barbarian Clippe. But there seems no doubt in my mind that to an Augustan reader of Ovid's text, the mention of a horned figure would recall the image in one of the city's most dramatic new public monuments. Ovid was intimately engaged, as we've seen in a prior talk, with Augustan politics, and a relationship between the poet and this Augustan monument provides support for Galinsky's initial conclusion. But Ovid's attitude of play and irony opens up a range of reactions and associations in interpreting characters and episodes throughout the Metamorphoses with current-day politics in mind. The degree to which Ovid is critical or sincere in his praise of Augustus and his family is a matter of great scholarly debate in the whole of the Metamorphoses, and at its conclusion in particular. So I plan to discuss various ways in which one might interpret lines, images, and words within the episode with this monument in mind. And without access to this normally private building during the CSS, I know I never would have thought to write about this piece and think about the Metamorphoses the way I do. And with that, let me close with a few thank yous to current director Eliza Wong and Elizabeth Rodini, who is interim director when I was here, former Mellon professor Lane Lancaster, current Mellon professor Marla Stone, AAR staff, especially Ann Coulson and Sebastian Hurl, my assistants, great assistants, last year Grace Funston and currently Andy Lund. Sophia Ekman aided me in obtaining permissions during the summer of 2021, and the past 2 summers, Julia Barra has admirably handled this role, without whose assistance, diligence, and organization, the program simply doesn't happen. And finally, a thank you to the participants, both last year and this summer, who I've had the pleasure to lead in what I hope has been an impactful summer, just like the one I once had. So thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. We are going to switch the program slightly so that we will conclude with the conversation between Kathy Geffican and Sebastian Hurl, and we will now have reminiscences from Liz Bartman first, and then Miles McDonald. Elizabeth Bartman was a 1981 Rome Prize Fellow, a 2009 resident and classical summer school assistant director, a 2009 resident at the Academy, and a classical summer school assistant director in 1982. She is an independent scholar and research affiliate at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Marla. I served as Catherine Gefkin's assistant in the CSS of 1982 and have made guest appearances for about 20 years now, so I have a long perspective as both participant and observer. I was selected as assistant after Kathy heard me give a presentation and realized that my booming voice would be an asset to the program. Indeed, one of my proudest moments was holding the group's attention at the Arapakis amidst the roar of Lungotevere traffic. This was long before Richard Meyer's architectural box made it much more hermetically sealed, 1982. The assistantship was my first real academic gig, and as a graduate student, I was in fact lower in rank than some professorial participants. We had a mix of students, some grad students, 1 or 2 undergrads, 2 professors, and the rest high school Latin teachers. There was also an older woman, Myrtle Irk, who had done the program decades earlier and was returning for a second time. There were 3 nuns among the teachers who wore full habits, including headgear and numerous constrictive undergarments. Neither Myrtle nor the sisters ever complained about heat or physical stress from the long days. In fact, no one complained about much of anything. The students lived at the Centro and mainly survived on takeout food from the nearby Rosticceria, the site now occupied by Lumiere di Sicilia, or just panini. The program lasted 6 weeks and proceeded in roughly chronological order, from the Etruscans to the Tetrarchs and early Christians. Our focus was topography, with regular forays into art and literature, the former covered by me and the latter being supplied by Kathy. How I regret never having taken notes on her presentations. We made site visits virtually every day. A glance at the syllabus shows that 5 or 6 consecutive days in the field were typical, with occasional 6 p.m. lectures on special topics like the Janicolo, John Darms, or Cicero, Jane Crawford. So this was total immersion, trial by fire, so to speak. As a student of Richard Brilliant, I knew the major monuments, of course, but the inadequacies of the Academy's programming during my fellowship year, something that Ingrid can also attest to, meant that I was seeing many sites, especially those outside Rome, for the first time. My first lesson was that the world of the graduate student is very different from that of the summer school. And an early first challenge was to learn how to present complex material in a lively manner to a learned but non-specialist audience. Organization, preparation, synthesis, and clear oration. These were among the legacies of my teaching in the classical summer school, and they have served me well in my career. Another legacy is the ethos of Kathy Gefkin. Back in 1982, Kathy had already been associated with the Academy for nearly 30 years, and so was fully versed in the classical school and its mission. Kathy instilled in me her view that the summer school plays a fundamental role in strengthening classical studies in America. It does so primarily by introducing high school teachers from across America to the great monuments of Rome. Teachers for whom the summer school was a transformative experience that they would pass on to their students, thereby seeding future generations of classicists. In our summer, and for many decades, most of the teachers were supported by funding from the Fulbright Foundation, which embraced study abroad as a means of enhancing intercultural understanding. Many things have changed since the early 1980s, when Kathy was director and I her assistant. But as the summer school looks to the next century, I hope that it remains true to its core mission of introducing its students physically to Rome and its monuments. For some students, this will be the sole visit of their lifetimes, and thus, as much time as possible should be invested in the unique experience of firsthand viewing and engagement. As the British philosopher, historian, and archaeologist R.G.C. Collingwood noted a century ago, and I quote, "Get a Roman road, or for that matter, any road, under your feet, and you enter the spirit of the men who made it. You see the country through their eyes. You get into your bones a feeling of what they meant to do with the country and how they meant to do it." Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Next up, we have reminiscences from Miles McDonald, 1998 Rome Prize Fellow, Classical Summer School participant in 1981, and director from 2004 to 2007. Miles is professor of history in the Department of History at Queens College at the City University of New York. Welcome to the podium, Miles.
Well, it's seeing so many people here who have been friends for years is a bit overwhelming. To say their kindness and generosity over the years is more than I can express in words, and more than I can ever repay. So thank you for having me here. This is about reminiscences. So I'm going to talk about memory and history, since I'm an historian. And now as an old man, I'm losing my memory. So two go together. And I'll start with a quotation from a great American historian, a guy named Richard White, called Remembering Ahad And what he says is, history is the enemy of memory. And numbers of things, now that I'm old, numbers of things that I have changed. I teach in a history department, and the history department is at CUNY. So lots of my colleagues write about the history of New York City, and some of them write about fairly recent history. And somebody who spent most of his life writing about things that happened 2,000 years ago, it's unnerving to read history, to talk to colleagues where they're writing about things not only that I witnessed, or some I even participated in. It's a shock to read history that you find yourself in or involved in. So that's one sort of great change I found in my dotage. The second thing I being older and I look back on, is my attitude towards institutional traditions. For various reasons, personal and psychological. I've been ambivalent about institutions and institutional traditions. Sort of quoting Byron, among them, but not of them, is what I used to say to myself a lot. But again, being a part of the American Academy, and particularly being part of the classical summer school, it's satisfying. The fact that, this is 100 years old, and it's particularly satisfying that I can say that I was a student at the classical summer school, and my teacher was Kathy Gefkin, and now the director is Sanjaya, who was my student. That's a great satisfaction to me, and I'm very happy to be able to say that. And I'll just give two reminiscences. Once from when I was a student in 1981, and then once from when I was a director. I was a director for 4 years rather than 3 because the last year the library was being renovated and they asked me to stay on 1 extra year. I think it was extremely hot that last year, but it was fine. One of the great things about, both when I was a student and I tried to do this when I was a director, is that when you're at the academy, the director brings in people at the academy to talk and present things who were their teachers or their mentors. So it sort of takes the tradition back another generation. And I'll talk about things that happened in 1981. In 1981, there were some really memorable people. Kathy will remember Charlie Zabrowski was with us, unforgettable character, but there were some difficulties. That is, there were that year 2 high school Latin teachers from Chicago who were not at all happy. And that's okay. But they were kept expressing how unhappy they were. At the time the Centro was staying at the people were staying at the Intercollegiate Center, where the meals were really, really great. They were sort of, pasta every night. And these women continually would say, pasta again, pasta again. Why can't we get some steak? We get steak in Chicago, which was annoying enough. But also the assistant director that year was a guy named Joe Alkermes. And he had come on very late because, as Kathy had later explained to me, Barbara Kellum was supposed to be the assistant director, but at the last minute got a job at Smith, where she's still teaching. So Joe came on very late in the game, and Joe really did late antiquity, and he just got married, and he was living in the Centro, and it was very, very difficult for Joe. He did a great job, but it was, I was living in the same building as him, and he was up all night long preparing this stuff because he didn't have much time to prepare. And what really annoyed me is that when we were out in the sites, these 2 women who didn't like pasta started making rude remarks about Joe, and said, "Oh, he's supposed to be a teacher," and this kind of thing. So I was not happy, and Kathy wasn't happy either. But it all came to fruition when we went to Largo, Argentina, because Kathy invited. By the way, if you haven't been, it's open to the public. If you haven't been there, you should go because you can actually now get into and see Temple D on Villa Florida. I was there a few days ago. Worth the trip. Anyway, she had, Largo Argentina was presented by Larry Richardson. And Larry Richardson is, we're talking about sort of a different, it sort of reminds me of almost Edith Wharton kind of. Larry Richardson, who was married to a distinguished Etruscologist, Emmeline Richardson, taught at Duke for many years. And I think Larry Richardson, wrote his first book when he was an undergraduate at Yale. Very distinguished guy. But when Larry Richardson and Emily Richardson came to Rome, they didn't take planes. They took the Queen Mary, and they brought big dogs with them. And they purportedly had, big apartment in Trastevere. So we're there at Largo, Argentina, and Larry shows up in this exquisite cream-colored suit. I don't remember he was wearing an ascot, but he should have been. So we get it there, and he's presenting the place, and we get to the point where we're looking at the inscription to Aulus Postumius, which is in front of Temple D, which is under a pavement. So you really can't get at it unless you get down on your hands and knees. So Larry got down on his hands and knees, and he had a flashlight, and then proceeded to crawl underneath the pavement so he could get a good look. And then Larry came out with this cream-colored suit, absolutely filthy, but somehow looking no less elegant than when he got in. And the first thing he did, and I think Kathy set this up, but she wouldn't admit it, the first thing he did was pick out these 2 Latin teachers and give them a flashlight and said, went like that, And Larry was the kind of person you did not say no to. So they went in there, and that was one of the high moments of that summer. The second reminiscence I'll give is from 2004, which was the second year that I did the summer school. And anybody who's done a summer school, anything with students, knows that the most difficult, it's nightmarish, is when you take groups of students to the Vatican Museum. I mean, it's expensive, it's big, it's crowded. They make you go through a route, and they're all nasty for some reason. Everybody's nasty in there, right? So the difficulty was we had permissions to see particular galleries that we usually closed. But as I remember, the permissions were early in the morning, 9 o'clock or something like that. And the problem was, you had, 25 or 30 people, and, there were lines to get in this museum. So in order to be online, which means near the front of the line, so that you can get in by 9 o'clock, you've got to get there at some god-awful. So the guy who was the assistant director the first year, Justin Walsh, who'd excavated for years at Morgantina, and had a sort of a Sicilian turn of mind, came up with a solution to this problem. So he called me and said, Miles, he says, there's no point everybody getting up in the morning. What I'll do is I'll go out early and stand online, right? And then you show up at about 8:45, and we'll go in, and, so we did this. And, it worked great. Terrific, okay? So, the next year, what I used to do after the first year, because if you're the director, you choose the assistant director from the pre-docs who were fellows. So what I did, and I continue to do this, I would contact the person who had been the assistant director the previous year. So I contacted Justin. I said, well, who do you think should do that? And he recommended David Petrain. So David did it. And, I said, oh, okay, going to the Vatican, we'll do the same thing. But David had never been to Sicily and didn't have a Sicilian mentality. So David went down, and he stood on some terrible hour in the morning. And I came in with a group of people at 8:45, and we cut in the middle of the line. And there was an American woman standing, I'm in trouble right away, American woman standing behind us. And she looked at me, and she said, I think it's very rude what you've just done, and cut in the line. Well, I gave her a look, and she was sort of recognizable. So I pulled out the permission, which had the Vatican seal, and I said, Madam, this is from the Holy Father. And she blessed herself and went like that, and everything was fine. However, there was a rather large, middle-aged Dutch guy who didn't speak any English except some very foul language, which he was using. And his daughter was with him, an adult woman who spoke English, and he wasn't having any of this. He was cursing and fuming. And I tried not to pay attention to him. But David, being a really sweet guy, tried to explain to him by holding the document up, and he knocked the document out of his hand, and it really became sort of... Luckily, there was a guy who was a Latin teacher who I had gone to graduate school with, who we had done a fair amount of drinking in graduate school and gotten in some tussles at the time, and he heard the commotion and he's an ex-football player. So he came up and stood next to me, and we got in. Well, the next year comes around, and I'm just trying to say, who should I choose as the assistant director? So I called David up, and David's on the phone, and he said, well, are you planning to go to the Vatican? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I got the right guy for you. And he said, the guy you want is a guy named Hendrik Dye. Now, I don't know if you know Hendrik Dye. Hendrik Dye is about 6'4", and designed by the same people who did Stonehenge. So he's just a huge guy, So I sent Hendrik down. And as it turned out that Hendrik's Italian is very good, but he also he lived in Rome for a while, he spoke Romanesque dialect. So when we got down there, Hendrik was talking, he talked to the guards about how much he loved Roma and hated Lazio. So when we get down to the guards, we're all sweet, would say, stand on line, nonsense. Come in and have coffee with us, you know? So the moral of the story is you never know what's going to happen when you go to the Vatican Museum with people. Well, that's the, what I would like to say, one of the things that always struck me while I was director was the extraordinary quality of all the pre-docs who were assistant directors for me. And they were Justin Walsh, David Petrain, Hendrik Dye, and Lisa Mignone. And last year, I was in Rome last year, which was extremely hot. And Sanjay was talking to me about things. And the program was going to start, and it was a Sunday night. I was living on Viale di Quattroventi, and I got an email from Sanjaya to say, I've just tested positive for COVID, and I'm in quarantine for a week. Can you do the program for the first week? So they dragged me out of mothballs, and I went down to the program, and Grace Fonstein was the assistant director, and my experience with her was the same. I learned lots from each of the assistant directors while I was director, so that tradition, I'm sure, goes on. Now, those reminiscences is what I think I remember. I'm not sure. And if history is the enemy of memory, perhaps someday someone will write a history of what happened, and maybe I'll be shown wrong. But I'd like to say something about, when I'm pointedly saying write a history of what happened. And this is pointed, if you like. I'm saying history, not a cultural studies or historiography or some kind of literary study, but a history. Because history is a severe discipline with demanding rules, difficult to do if you do it right, but worth the effort. And I'll end with a quote from Richard White about what the relationship between history and memory is. He writes, "Memory is a living thing, vulnerable to a dead past until memory itself dies with its creator. History is a dead thing, brought to a new life. It is fragments of the past, dead and gone, resurrected by historians. It threatens our versions of ourselves, and that's a very good thing." Thanks.
I want to sort of thank Miles again for stepping into the breach last summer when we got those emails late Sunday night, and I thought, is the first week of the classical summer school going to be about 20th century Italian history, possibly? So, and we're going to conclude now with a conversation between Kathy Geffican and Sebastian Hurl. We had originally done a wonderful film. Lynn Lancaster went to Atlanta and interviewed Kathy because we didn't think Kathy would be coming, and we had planned to show this film. And then yesterday, Kathy appeared in the library to great joy from all of us. And the rumor went around the academy, Kathy is here, Kathy is here. So we are so pleased to have you here in person, Kathy. And I personally like to say that you're a role model for me, and that I hope when I am in your position, I can show up at the academy unannounced. So please come to the chairs, Sebastian Hurl and Kathy Geffican. Yes. And then after the conversation, we will go upstairs for a reception and dinner and continue the conversation. Kathy, please come up.
So you're Lynn.
Yes, I'm Lynn. And I'm sorry we don't get to see the movie because it was an excellent movie, also introducing Kathy. And Yes.
We're going to post it online.
And yeah, it's going to be posted online. Wonderful. And we're going to, of course, continue the discussion upstairs.
Her apartment in Cincinnati.
Yes.
Elizabeth Harris was with me.
So this is completely off the cuff and not at all prepared, since Kathy showed up yesterday to all of our great surprise and fondness and happiness.
Epiphany.
So one of the questions I wanted to start out with, especially since I won't repeat the questions in the movie, is what is your most pleasant memory of the classical summer school, of leading this classical summer school?
Do what?
Your most pleasant memory of being a director of the classical summer school?
Pleasant memories?
Yes.
Well, I mean, while I was sitting here, since I expected to see myself in a movie instead of talking, I was thinking about what I might say off the cuff, because I don't have a text, and listening to what everybody was saying. And I do thank Suzanne for the photograph. And I have one of you, I think, Suzanne. And also, my assistants, Barbara Kellum's name came up. She was a valiant assistant in my first summer when I didn't know what I was doing, really, except that I'd been at the Intercollegiate Center. And that is something we need to stress, because since the Centro began in the late 60s and the summer school was going on and on and on, there's been a real symbiosis between the two programs. If you look at the cast of characters, you'll find that a lot of the instructors in the summer school have had Centro experience, or they will later have it. So there's a very strong sense of that. But, and in fact, so I had some background, but Barbara Kellum was a wonderful stabilizing force. She took over the job of sitting on the bus and talking to the students individually about how things were going, and she helped people find dissertation topics, which I thought was amazing. While I sat in the front of the bus, because I inherited the bus company that George Houston, my predecessor, liked, because it was very cheap, and boy, with cheapness, it was absolutely awful. We had, you really wondered whether the buses were going to make the turns on the hairpin roads. And I got to the point where I couldn't sit in the jump seat at the front and had to go to the back, because one of our drivers would hit the parapets that kept you from going over 1,000 feet into a ravine, and the same man clicked his false teeth all the time. Every time he thought he was going to go over the ravine, he would click his false teeth. And Barbara was absolutely a wonderful stabilizing force. And then but she couldn't go on with me the next summer because she had to finish her dissertation. Her Harvard professor said she could not do it again. It took too much out of her. So Joe came on at the last minute, and Miles mentioned Joe. And when I think back about Joe, I will be always grateful to him for saving me from being arrested. Because that was the summer when the police were after people who didn't have a regular license as a tourist, a little pin here. And these people who were the registered tour guides would hang around the entrance to the forum to wait for people like me. And then they would go get the police. And we had changed bus drivers and bus companies, fortunately. So we had a much better bus, and we had more alert drivers who knew where they were going, thank heavens. And and somebody came out, we were leaving the forum, and somebody came out of nowhere and grabbed me. And Joe said, it whispered to me that he was telling the driver who just pulled up, because they can't park there, just pulled up, that he was to go like lightning when I got on the bus. Fortunately, everybody else was getting on, and Joe pushed me on the bus. He slammed the door, and we ran. We almost ran over the people. I should always appreciate that. I know somebody who was arrested. So, and Liz is right. I did go on field trips in the fall of 1981 looking for my next assistant for 1992. And I thought somebody's got to be hurt over traffic. And Liz could be hurt over traffic. But I shall always be grateful to her for holding her own in front of the Laocoon in the Vatican. We had people coming up on us. We had tour guides coming up on us. They said, why were we standing there so long? Boy, she didn't give up. We had that statue for ourselves, and it was our piece. But at any rate, and in 1991, when I came back and did another summer, Ilinaj was my assistant, and Ili had a way of pacifying anybody who was upset, which was a great asset. And she helped me that day. Miles, I'll never forget when you asked me on the bus on the way to Alba Food Chains. I'm switching topics, but I make it clear why. You asked me, where are we going? We were somehow the topic came up about the bus letting air out of its brakes or something, and you said, incidentally, where are we going? And I thought, oh my God, I didn't tell them where we were going. Or something to that effect. It was certainly on the schedule. But at any rate, and Ellie helped me a lot. There was on the way to Alba Food Chains in 1991, we encountered a whole school full of students those were the days when you had to use the bathroom at the last stop on the autostrada because there were no facilities inside the site, and then when we came out of the site. So we told everybody, this is when you have to go. So all the women in the group arrived at the ladies' room, and there's a whole school of grammar school students in there. And the teacher looked at us, and Ellie and I looked at one another, what are we going to do? There were only 2 stalls. And the teacher organized her students into a line, one stall. And she kept saying, "A che punto siamo? A che punto siamo?" And she pushed the little girls inside. And we managed to get out of there. But Ellie was, was serene through all of these calamities. I wasn't so serene. And especially the day that Virginia, what was her name? Sister Virginia Robinson, lost her veil out of the window. The nun. We were coming back from Tarquinia. We were coming down the road, boom, down the Via Aurelia, was it? And we were headed bang back to Rome. And all of a sudden, the sister's veil went out of the window. So we had to stop, and some nice young man got off the bus and found the veil in the middle of a bush. And sister got dressed again. So there are a lot of things that happen that you don't expect.
And A follow-up question, I think we could go on for many, many minutes, but a follow-up question is also after Suzanne so eloquently talked about it, and Lisa and others tonight, is how did the classical summer school impact you? What
How did it
impact you?
impact me?
What did it teach you? What did it help you?
Well, I guess I should say I should have become better in handling certain kind of people, especially when Miles talked about the summer of '81, which was the difficult summer of my 4 summers because of that. And the group, as I saw it, was really those people who wanted to do what we were doing and those people who didn't, who thought they'd come for a holiday. I later learned that one of the worst perpetrators of trouble did some kind of apology. I don't know about that, but I heard that. I don't think I think I understood how I should change. I'm not sure I did. I remember having conversations with Larry Richardson, who is, as Miles put it, was always impeccably dressed. In fact, I remember one time we waited a very long time for his new waistcoat to arrive from the tailor because he wouldn't go to an event without the new waistcoat. But I had many talks with him about the level and how to incorporate the vast range of people. I had had talks with George Houston about that before, my predecessor. I said, what level do you try to hit? I went with him one day to see what he was doing in the summer of 1979. And I decided I wasn't going to run a party. And we had a program. We needed to take advantage of every site that we could do. In those days, we could afford to have the bus 6 days a week. That's one of the big differences, of course, now. So we could be out every day. It was pretty relentless, I would say. At least two days in the city and maybe sometimes as many as 3 out of town. And it was hard on people. And I would say, but it made me think about learning to teach on site is a very different experience from teaching in the classroom. And I had some experience in the collegiate center with that, which I'd done before. And that's something I tried to work on more in the summer. But I think I see people nodding that it is a different experience. And I remember watching in the Centro, there were 2 young men who were fascinated with archaeology, who did a field trip with Forrest. And I learned, in fact, they already understood the preparation they had to make to go to the site, decide where to stand, decide in what direction to look, so that your students will see what you are trying to teach. And we did have some people who would lecture in full sunshine for hours on end, some of our guest speakers, and you would see everyone wilting. Well, there are all these things. Now, I tried to learn these things. I think by maybe 1991, I might have known a little bit more.
And so I think we could continue talking, but before we go upstairs and do so over an aperitivo at the reception, is there anything you would like to say about the Classical Summer School before we go upstairs?
Well, first of all, I think it's, there are 2 things, I guess, I would say. I think it is There have been times when this program might not have survived. First of all, it took 16 years to get it going. They started planning this in the 1890s, shortly after the classical school was founded. And they didn't manage to start until 1923. Of course, there was World War I in there. That was one of the problems. The other was the merger of the American Classical School with the Academy, which complicated things a great deal. And one never realizes that when that merger occurred, the classical school, which was not well funded, became even poorer because it lost the support of the Archaeological Institute of America and the Carnegie Foundation. And so it was a very poor matter, a poor enterprise. So it took till 1923. And when you think about what Grant Showerman did, which he did until 1932, when he had, in the Virginian year of 1930, he ran it twice, and he had up to 100 students in the program, and he had no assistant. Then there was a gap of about 4 years in the Depression when no teacher or student could afford to come for the program. So it was canceled. And also, there was a change in administration here, which affected all of these things. Gorham Stevens left in 1932, Showerman left in 1932, and Frank Fairbanks, the professor of fine arts, left in 1932. So there entered a period of difficulty for a couple of years before Aldrich arrived as director. And Henry Rowell started the summer school again right before the war. Then you get the war interfering, World War II interfering, and for 6 years it didn't exist, and then it started back with Rowell again, Professor Rowell again in 1947, and it almost died in the early 50s because nobody could afford to come. It was saved by the Fulbright program, because the Fulbright program, there were many professors who went after the Fulbright program here in Italy to help. And they started off with 20 scholarships. By the time I came on board, there were 10. But that saved the program in the early 50s. And then in 1981, I reread a letter I got recently. I was going through some files. And this preceded Miles's summer. I was told that the summer school was on the block and was going to be scrapped because the Academy had no money. And it was saved by some trustees who said it had to go on. And so when you think about that, plus the changing picture of teachers in America, which I won't go into, the changing sites that are available, the changing finances, which affect how you get around, whether you have the bus or not, you just think of all of the things that have developed. And the other thing to mention that hasn't been today, and the outreach, which I'm glad you mentioned, Lisa, is the support of the many classical societies. I think in particular of geographically going from Kane to the New York Classical Club, that Empire State used to have scholarships, Cass, the Adelaide Hahn Scholarship, she complained. She was here in 1929 or 30, and she wrote a letter which complained of the curriculum, that why did we do all this papal stuff? It wasn't important. But the scholarship is named for her from that area. And then Camas with his scholarships, Eta Sigma Phi, the Ohio Classical Club, which I think doesn't support it anymore, the University of Toronto Scholarship, which came every other year. These people had meetings at local regional meetings that helped to support this program.
I think Kathy is our living memory, and we're very fortunate to have her. So please give her a round of applause. Please also watch the movie, and we have some images prepared from the Classical Summer School, and we look forward to further discussion with Kathy and all of us upstairs.
Yes, and thank you to all the speakers today, and we'll toast to the next 100 years.
Ask Miles if I can see a bottle of wine at your house as a surprise.